The rain had not stopped for hours. It fell in a slow, steady rhythm, soft enough to muffle footsteps, heavy enough to darken the earth to near black. In places where the ground gave way, water had gathered into thin, sluggish streams, weaving through the roots and ditches along the edge of the service road. The fields beyond were empty, hushed. Trees leaned into the weight of the storm, and the air carried the clean, sharp scent of wet bark and clay. On the far side of a gravel turnoff, a man walked alone. His coat clung to him, soaked through. He moved with the aimless patience of someone used to this kind of silence. His eyes scanned the verge, watching the shadows shift under the gray light. Then he stopped. There was something just beyond the ditch, crumpled low into the mud, a shape too still for anything alive. Small, like a bit of trash or a piece of cloth left behind. But then a flicker, a twitch, not even a movement, more like a breath-given shape. And with it came the faintest sound, high and thin, a whimper barely breaking through the veil of rain. He stepped closer, crouching carefully. The figure was curled tight into itself, a bundle of soaked fur and trembling limbs. A puppy, no more than a few weeks old, though the filth and wet clung so thick it was hard to say what kind. Its eyes were half-lidded, barely open. One paw was folded awkwardly beneath its body, as if it had fallen there and not yet found the strength to shift. Its ribs rose and fell in a shallow rhythm, each breath more like a shiver than a sign of life. The man didn't speak at first. He extended a hand slowly, letting his fingers hover just over the puppy's shoulder. The animal didn't flinch, but neither did it lift its head. There was no fear, only the heavy stillness of exhaustion. Rain pooled in the hollow of its spine. A breath passed, then two. He moved his hand gently, brushing aside some of the grit and leaves matted in the fur. It was ice-cold beneath his palm. His voice came low, no louder than the rain. "It's okay, girl." The words were not meant for comfort. They were simply an offering, a quiet presence in the storm. Around them, the world remained unchanged. A bird shifted on a high branch, sending a spatter of droplets to the ground. The wind moved through the grass in gentle threads, carrying the faint smell of something metallic, old fence wire, perhaps, rusting where the ditch began. The man glanced toward the road, but no cars passed. No headlights pierced the mist. There was no one else to call, no shelter nearby, just a decision, drawn out across the line between instinct and care. He took off his coat, easing the fabric beneath the fragile body, lifting it with both hands. The puppy let out a dry, broken cough, then stilled again. Her ears, if they had ever pricked with sound, were flat against her head. Mud streaked her legs. Flecks of gravel clung to the pads of her paws. Her eyes opened for a moment. Not fully, but just enough to find the shape of the man's face above her. Then they closed again, not from peace but from the sheer gravity of survival. Her breathing stuttered, a fragile rhythm, like leaves caught in the wind. He cradled her against his chest, coat wrapped close to hold in what little warmth could be shared. His own body tensed against the cold, but he moved slowly, steadily, as if the slightest jostle might unmake the life in his arms. Water trickled from the folds of his coat as he walked. Each step was careful. The gravel gave underfoot, the world blurred with gray. But the shape he carried, too light, too silent, held every ounce of his attention. Behind him, the ditch filled with more water, washing clean the place where she had lain. The rain erased all prints, all signs. Only the faint sound of breathing, hers and his, held the moment in place. By the time they reached the edge of the trees, the sky had begun to soften. Not clear, but less heavy. A pale glow filtered through the clouds, enough to give the leaves a sheen of silver. He paused beneath a leaning birch, shifting the weight in his arms slightly. Her nose twitched once. A reflex. Her limbs hung limp, but her body was no longer trembling. It was a small thing, the absence of shaking, but it mattered. The man whispered again, just under his breath. "You're almost there." He wasn't sure if she heard or if it mattered. But it was all he could offer, and somehow it felt enough. Somewhere behind them, a branch cracked in the distance, and a crow took off into the pale sky. The rain kept falling. But in that quiet, beneath the hush of trees and breath and water, something had shifted. The stillness had been broken. Life, though faint and fragile, had been found. The puppy's weight was barely noticeable in his arms, yet the shape of her pressed against him carried a weight all its own. Her body, so small and soaked through, gave off no heat of its own. He could feel her ribs beneath the thin fur, each breath rattling faintly as if air itself were a struggle. Stillness lingered in her limbs, not the calm of sleep, but the limp heaviness of something that had run out of ways to resist. His coat, wrapped gently around her, sagged with rain and mud. He paused by the edge of the trees, kneeling slowly in the shelter of low branches. His hands, rough from years of labor, moved with unusual care. He adjusted the folds of fabric around her side, cradling her head to rest inside the crook of his arm. She whimpered, soft and hoarse, a sound more instinct than plea. It wasn't painful. It was the sound of something too tired to cry properly, but too young to be quiet. Water dripped steadily from his sleeves as he pulled her closer. Her paw twitched once, curling in on itself, then unfurled with a tiny shudder. The man lowered his face slightly, watching for any flicker of response. Her eyes remained closed, but her ears shifted faintly as he exhaled. It was barely a sign, yet it held the shape of something alive. In the woods, everything moved slowly. Wind slipped between the trees in long, low breaths. Leaves shimmered with the weight of water. Somewhere nearby, a distant woodpecker knocked softly on hollow bark. These were the quiet rhythms of a world unchanged by the presence of two figures beneath the canopy, one human, one barely holding on. He adjusted his grip, easing her closer to his chest. There was no rush in his movements, though the urgency lay just beneath the skin. She needed warmth, shelter, food. He didn't know if she would survive the walk. But leaving her was no longer a question. His boots pressed into the softened earth as he stood, water squelching beneath him. The rain had lightened now, a mist more than a downpour, yet the cold still clung to everything it touched. She cried out once as he lifted her, a broken, breathless whine that fell away as quickly as it came. Not pain, just effort. He paused, holding her close. "You're all right," he murmured. The words were simple, nearly soundless, and meant only for her. They carried no promise, only presence. The road was little more than gravel and washed-out soil stretching ahead through the trees. He walked with steady steps, keeping her wrapped tight, careful not to jostle her fragile limbs. Her breathing stayed shallow. But it held. Once she stirred against his chest, her nose pressing into the damp fabric. Her mouth opened slightly, then stilled. No more sound came. The man glanced down, heart heavy but unreadable on his face. There was no place here for guessing or hoping, only action. The closest help was still a long way off, a vet who worked out of a shed behind his home, a half-hour's walk at best. But even that seemed too far when every breath felt borrowed. She made no more noise. Her body, once racked with trembling, was now quiet. Not in peace, but in a fragile kind of surrender. Her paws hung loose beneath the fold of the coat, streaked with dirt and dried blood at the claws. He didn't know how long she had been there, curled by that ditch. Hours, maybe longer. A body that small didn't have long to spare in the cold. The rain eased further, becoming a thin mist that clung to everything. His breath fogged in front of him, a steady rhythm he kept in time with hers. One breath, then another, again. She shifted once more, her paw catching on the edge of his sleeve. Her ear twitched. And then, nothing. He kept walking. A crow passed overhead in silence, wings slicing through the low gray sky. The trees began to thin, giving way to open land. Fence posts leaned at odd angles, and the smell of wet hay hung faint in the air. Just beyond the bend was the old gravel path that led toward shelter. She did not stir again, but he held her closer still, as if the act alone could offer what the world had tried to take. Behind them, the woods stood quiet. Rainwater dripped from the canopy in slow intervals, each drop marking the space where she had once lain. And ahead, the wind began to shift, carrying with it the first scent of dry earth and something warm. It was not safe. Not yet. But it was the first step toward it. The truck's engine ticked faintly as it cooled, soft ping swallowed by the hush of mist still lingering over the road. Inside the cab, the puppy lay curled on a folded blanket, her body barely rising with breath. The heater pushed a low stream of warmth toward her, just enough to lift the damp from her fur. She had not moved since he laid her down, save for a single, involuntary twitch of her hind leg. The coat he had used to carry her lay nearby, heavy with water and mud. Outside, the man stood still. One hand rested lightly on the truck door. His eyes were fixed not on the road ahead but on the edge of the woods behind him. Something pressed at the edge of his thoughts. Not a sound exactly, but a pause, a silence with weight to it. He turned slowly, as if the air itself had shifted. His boots found the earth again, careful not to stir too much gravel, and he began to walk. The rain had fully passed, though the sky remained cloaked in clouds. Damp clung to the ground in layers, and each footstep sent tiny ripples through shallow puddles scattered across the clearing. The place where he had found the puppy was not far, only minutes behind him, but it already felt removed, as if the ground had grown quieter in his absence. He stepped into the soft verge of the ditch, letting his eyes scan the undergrowth. His gaze moved across fallen leaves, flattened grass, and the damp edge of a torn plastic bag tangled in a vine. He crouched low. The ditch was deeper than it had seemed at first. Its shadows stretched longer now that the rain no longer smoothed the light. Then, the faintest shift, a shape within shapes. No sound, just a subtle change in the texture of the earth. He leaned closer, fingers grazing a patch of wet bramble, and saw it. Nestled tight beneath a collapsed tuft of grass, no more than a few inches away from the spot where the first puppy had been, lay another, smaller. Her fur was darker, matted thick with mud, making her almost indistinguishable from the soil beneath her. She didn't cry. She didn't stir. But her chest rose just once, then again, slowly, as if unsure whether to continue. The man reached forward without speaking. His hand hovered for a moment, watching for movement. There was none. He slid his fingers beneath her carefully, lifting her with the same steadiness he had used before. Her body sagged in his palm, soaked, feather-light and frighteningly still. One ear was folded back, her eyes closed tight. As he brought her closer, her jaw moved ever so slightly, a flutter more than a sound, and her paw flexed weakly against the air. He cradled her close to his chest, instinct guiding every motion. The cold had reached deep inside her. Her fur held the chill of hours exposed, and her skin gave off no warmth of its own. But she was alive, just barely. A breath escaped him, though not of relief. This wasn't a rescue yet. It was a rescue in motion, suspended between hope and what the body can endure. He turned back, boots sinking softly into the earth with each step. At the truck, he opened the door with the quiet care of someone holding something fragile. The warmth inside reached toward them like breath. He placed the second puppy alongside the first, adjusting the blanket to cradle them both. Their bodies did not touch, but there was a quiet symmetry in the way they curled, one still, the other barely stirring. The heater's hum continued, a constant stream of soft air that carried a faint scent of wet fur and iron. The man sat in the driver's seat, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. For a long moment, he didn't start the engine. His eyes were on the rearview mirror, watching the trees, as if something might follow, or as if something else had been left unseen. Inside the cab, the two puppies lay motionless. The second was quieter than the first, though her breath too began to deepen. Her side rose in uneven intervals, one breath, then a pause, then another. The first pup shifted slightly, her nose twitching once toward her sibling's scent. It wasn't recognition, it was instinct. Faint, lingering, barely there. A quiet whine emerged, low and weak. Not fear, not protest, just sound. The man reached back and adjusted the edge of the blanket, tucking it around them with the back of his hand. "You're all right now," he said. The words were nearly inaudible, spoken not for reassurance but as a way to anchor the moment, to mark that they had been found, that the cold had not taken everything. He started the engine. The tires rolled slowly across the gravel, parting a trail through shallow puddles and soft ruts. The road ahead would not be quick. There were still questions he couldn't answer. How long they'd been there, what else might have gone unseen. But for now, the cab was quiet, the heater warm, and the rhythm of breath, however fragile, had begun to return. In the rear view, the clearing faded from sight. Wet grass shimmered where the ditch met the edge of the woods, bending slightly under a passing breeze. And somewhere in the stillness, the shape of absence gave way to something else, a quiet, living presence, no longer hidden. The road darkened as clouds thickened once more, the light fading into a muted haze of steel gray. Wind curled across the open fields, pushing through half-flooded ditches and swaying the limbs of slender trees that lined the shoulder. In the cab of the truck, warmth rose in waves. Dry, steady, not hot, but enough to lift the edge of chill from wet fur and bone. The man drove slowly, one eye on the road, the other flicking back to the two small shapes resting behind him. They lie side by side now, a bundle of sodden fur pressed into a blanket folded with quiet care. The smaller of the two hadn't moved much. Her breath came in irregular patterns, sometimes too shallow to see, and her limbs remained curled tightly beneath her, as though braced against something long past. Her body held the chill deep. Where the first pup had begun to twitch faintly, seeking warmth, this one lay heavy and loose, her muscles slack with the weight of exhaustion. But her chest still rose, faint as a breeze in tall grass. It was enough. The man pulled off the main road, turning into a gravel path that led toward a small outbuilding at the edge of his property. Not a clinic, just a makeshift shelter lined with straw and old towels, its roof patched over the years with care more than skill. He parked with the engine running, then turned, reaching into the back seat. His hands moved without hesitation now. He knew the timing mattered. The body, when chilled so far, could slip into stillness quietly, even after warmth returned. He lifted them together this time, one arm cradling each fragile form, the blanket folded between them like a sling. The older pup stirred at the shift. Her ears twitched and a low sound, more breath than voice, slipped from her mouth. Not protest, not fear. Just the small confusion of being moved again. Her nose brushed against the flank of the other pup as he carried them inside. The shelter held no brightness, no lights except what filtered through the dusty pane of a window. But it was dry, and the air held a trace of hay, old wood, and something softer, the smell of cotton washed too many times. He laid the puppies gently on the floor, the blanket stretched over a layer of thick towels. Then he knelt beside them, resting his hand lightly against the colder one's back. Her skin gave under the touch like damp paper. No tension, no resistance. He began working slowly, fingers pressing warmth into her spine, pausing between strokes to check for breath. It came, weak but steadying, as if something within her had begun to stir beneath the surface. Beside her, the stronger pup shifted again. She turned her head slightly, nose searching, her movements uncoordinated and slow. She made no sound, but her paw extended, brushing against her sibling's side. There was no recognition in it, only instinct, the drive to find something familiar, something alive. When her paw found skin, she stilled. Her ribs moved in time with the rise and fall beside her. It was a fragile rhythm, but it was shared. The man worked in silence. He placed a warmed cloth across their backs, careful not to startle them. His movements were methodical, rooted in memory and repetition, lessons gathered not from books, but from years of caring for lives on the edge of the wild. Abandoned fawns, frostbitten lambs, birds too young to fly. Each life had carried its own question. These two were no different. The storm outside began to build again, not in downpour, but in wind. It rushed along the edge of the fields, lifting dry leaves into spirals and shaking loose the last of summer's gold from the trees. Inside, the space remained still. The smaller pup shivered once, her entire body reacting in a single spasm before settling again. Her jaw slackened slightly. A thin line of moisture traced from her nose, and she exhaled. A soft, rattling sigh that loosened the stiffness in her chest. He leaned closer. The breath was there, faint, but deeper now. Her limbs twitched faintly beneath the towel. When he moved the cloth to check her paws, he saw her toes curling, slow and jerky like the first frost beginning to melt from tender grass. Beside her, the stronger pup had begun to uncurl. Her spine shifted into a softer arc, and her nose pressed again into her sister's shoulder. They were not touching completely, but their bodies had drawn together, pulled by something neither knew how to name. Warmth passed between them, not enough to sustain them yet, but enough to bridge the distance carved by fear and cold. He added a second layer of cloth, folded from an old flannel shirt, and placed it over their backs. His hand lingered a moment on the smaller pup's neck. It was still too cold. But not lifeless. Not anymore. Time passed slowly. The light outside dimmed further, the last of the day lost behind thick banks of cloud. In the hush, the sound of wind pressing against the walls felt louder than it was. The man sat with his back to the wall, watching. He didn't speak. There was nothing to say, only small signs to notice. One paw, once curled tight, now lay open. A hind leg stretched slightly. Breath, once broken, had begun to fall into a tentative rhythm. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet, and then a shift. A low sound, almost inaudible, slipped from the space between the pups. Not a cry, not even a whimper. Just air passing through a throat learning how to carry sound again. The smaller one had moved. Her nose brushed against the other's side. Her body, though still weak, had begun to respond to the presence beside her. Their shapes curled toward each other, not in embrace, but in alignment. One head resting just behind the other's shoulder. Their spines touched now, faint warmth passing along the length of fur pressed gently together. Eyes remained closed. Limbs still trembled. But their bodies had found each other, and with it, something shifted in the stillness. The man remained seated, shoulders loose, breathing slow. His gaze held them both, not with expectation, but with quiet attention. The smallest signs mattered now. And in that quiet space, sheltered from the wind, wrapped in warmth, and held in the stillness that comes after rescue, a reunion had taken shape, not a moment of recognition, but of return. Outside, the wind softened for a time. Leaves brushed the window pane in long, slow arcs, their motion more gentle now than restless. The earth beyond remained wet, but the storm's edge had begun to fray, pulling light back into the folds of sky. Inside, the two pups lay motionless once more, but not as before. Their bodies breathed in tandem. Their limbs, though heavy, no longer clenched. The cold still clung to them, but it no longer ruled them. Between them, the space had closed. And in the fading light, with nothing left to prove or pursue, two beating hearts held on. Light returned slowly, not with brilliance, but with a gentle unrolling of the gray. The storm that had curled itself over the hills through the night had loosened its grip, and the sky above the fields began to shift. Thin streaks of pale gold pressed through the clouds, catching on the tops of the wet trees. Rain still clung to the branches, pooling at the tips of leaves, but it no longer fell. The wind had softened to a hush. Inside the shelter, the warmth held steady. The heater hummed faintly against the far wall, its coils no longer pushing against bitter cold, but maintaining something gentler, something that could be called comfort. The scent of wet fur still lingered in the air, mingling now with the drier notes of hay and cotton. The man had not slept. He sat with his back against the wall, arms folded loosely, eyes soft with the quiet stillness that only follows long uncertainty. In front of him, the two pups lay in a single blanket, their bodies tucked close as if they had always been meant to sleep side by side. Their breath moved in rhythm now, no longer ragged, no longer fighting. Each inhale was even and slow, as if the night had been enough to let their bodies surrender the tension of survival. The smaller one, still the weaker of the two, had curled inward slightly during the night. Her muzzle rested beneath her sister's neck, her paws drawn close to her chest, tail tucked in a shallow curve. She had not made a sound in hours, but her chest rose and fell in quiet determination. And that, he knew, was everything. The older pup had shifted too. Her front legs were stretched forward now, one paw draped loosely over her sibling's shoulder. It was not a gesture of knowing. It was instinct, guided by warmth and scent. Her ears flicked once at the sound of shifting straw, but her body did not stir. In the dim morning light, their coats had dried in places, revealing patches of soft fur beneath the mats of dirt, pale brown, flecked with ash. Just enough difference between them to mark one from the other, but enough similarity to say what words never could. The man exhaled quietly. He hadn't meant to stay awake, but sleep had felt too far, too fragile. So he'd watched. Through the dark hours and the slow ebb of rain, he had sat with them, checking their breath, adjusting the towels, warming water, and pressing it into their sides with the flat of his palm. Each time one stirred or twitched, he moved closer, anchoring their moments of distress in the calm of his presence. He hadn't spoken much, just a word or two now and then, enough to let them know they were not alone. He hadn't planned on finding them both, hadn't even planned on stopping that morning. But the path had carried him there, and something deeper, older, had told him to turn back. And now, watching them breathe side by side, he felt the weight of what had not been lost. The first pup would have survived, maybe, without her sister. But there was no question now. They had needed each other. The warmth they shared beneath the blanket was more than body heat. It was memory, presence, familiarity. Not in the way humans understand such things, but in the way animals remember scent, heartbeat, and the rhythm of breath beside their own. There had been fear between them, of course. That first night their bodies had trembled even when warmth surrounded them. But fear had softened into quiet. Quiet had softened into sleep. He reached forward, fingers brushing gently across their backs, checking for tension, for the signs he'd learnt to feel. There was none. No shallow panting, no sudden start. Their muscles had relaxed. They were holding on. He stood slowly, knees stiff from the long hours on the floor. Outside, the wind stirred the grass again, and the sound filtered through the cracks in the wood, whispering against the walls like breath. He stepped to the door, opening it halfway to let in the light. The sky beyond had changed. The clouds, though thick, were no longer low and heavy. They moved slowly, letting the pale sun glance off the wet earth. Puddles shimmered along the path. A sparrow darted from the eaves, wings slicing the still air. The earth had not healed overnight, but it was quieter now, softer. Carried by the storm, everything had shifted slightly. What had been hidden was now found. What had been still had begun to move. He stayed at the doorway for a moment longer, then returned inside. The pups remained as they were, sleeping. One stirred faintly as the wind passed through, ears twitching once, then settling again. He knelt beside them, adjusting the blanket where it had slipped back, making sure the edges covered both small bodies. Then, almost without thought, he said, "You're safe now." The words weren't meant to carry weight, but as he spoke, one of the pups stirred again. Her paw pressed closer into the blanket, her breath shifting for a moment, then evening out once more. He waited, hand resting lightly on the fabric, watching until stillness returned. There would be decisions to make later: food, medicine, care, a visit to the vet, gentle baths to remove what the rain had not. But none of that belonged to now. This moment, held in morning light and quiet breath, asked for nothing more than presence, and he gave it freely. The shelter grew warmer as the sun rose higher behind the clouds. Shadows moved gently across the floor. The air outside began to dry. And in the stillness, the man sat beside two lives that had survived the night not by strength alone, but by the fragile power of presence, of being held, not just by hands, but by the quiet space where fear had once lived. He hadn't meant to save both, hadn't known there were two. But now, looking at them curled beneath the folds of a worn blanket, he understood what the storm had brought him. Not just needed, not just weight, but something quieter, something rooted in connection. Outside, the grass swayed beneath the touch of wind, each blade bending gently before lifting again. Far across the field, a single tree stood bare-limbed against the soft gray, its branches moving slowly with the air. The storm had passed, but the shape it left behind still held. Not ruin, not silence, just two small hearts, beating quietly beneath the warmth of a morning that had not been promised, but had come anyway.